The candles in the sunken court had burned for 3 centuries without going out. I had heard that said since boyhood. Every young alpha of every great pack knew it, and yet nothing in my long years of ruling had prepared me for the actual sight of them. There were 47, set in iron rings that descended the old stone wall from ceiling to floor, and their flames did not gutter or lean. No wind moved them. The wax had not shortened by so much as a finger's width in 300 years, and when I descended to the court on the first evening of the iron moon and stood among them alone, the air was warm and absolutely still in a way that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with what lived chained at the court's heart. The Ironwing. I had seen it twice before in my life, once as a young lord attending at my father's side, and once as a newly crowned Alpha King when the old High Warden passed his seal to the next, and each time the sight of it had made the blood in my veins remember something older than thought. It was not a dragon as the old ballads described, all fire and wingspan and circling malice. The Ironwing was a dragon spirit, a thing of bound will and ancient compact, chained to the Warden's stone by an oath that predated every kingdom in the north. In its sleeping form it lay coiled around the great pillar at the court's center, its scales the color of a winter sky before snow, its wingspan folded flat against itself, its head resting on its own crossed forearms as peacefully as any sleeping hound. Chains of wrought silver ran from the collar at its throat to 4 anchor points in the floor. The chains were ceremonial. Every High Warden knew this. The real binding was the seal itself, the iron disc set in the stone of the pillar's base, engraved with the words of the founding oath in a script so old that only 2 scholars in the north could still read it. The seal made the Ironwing the guardian and the proof. When a new High Warden was named at the Iron Moot, they placed their palm against the disc. The disc warmed and glowed, and the Ironwing opened one great eye and was still a recognition, an acceptance, a passing of the pact. That was the ceremony. That was what we had come here to perform. 7 of us had come. 7 champion alphas representing the 7 great packs of the Northern Alliance, each sending their lord to vote, to witness, and to stand in the sunken court when the new High Warden was named. I was here as High Alpha, the presiding authority of the Iron Moot, the one who would read the vote and speak the name and then step back. I did not vote. I did not campaign. I held the Iron Moot's order, and when it was done, I would return to my own seat at Ironspire and let the new warden carry the weight I had carried for the past 7 years alone. 7 years since the last High Warden died without naming a successor. 7 years of holding the Northern Alliance together by pride and persuasion and the reputation of Ironspire without the pact's binding. 7 years of knowing that the Ironwing slept more restlessly with every passing season, and that the old seal was thinning. I had told myself we had time. I had told myself that every day for 7 years. The delegations arrived over the course of 2 days. Each great pack lord came with a retinue of 6 4-guard wolves, a seneschal, and a record keeper, because the Ironmoot required witness documentation of every word spoken and every vote cast. The great fortress of Ashenvere had stood on its granite promontory for 4 centuries, built expressly for this purpose, and its long receiving hall could hold all 7 delegations and their staff with room to spare. I greeted each lord formally, assigned quarters, confirmed the schedule, the opening rites on the first evening, the presentations of candidacy over 2 days, the vote on the morning of the 4th day, the naming ceremony that same afternoon. Clean and orderly, the sort of sequence I was built for. I was in the great hall on the morning of the 2nd day, going over the candidacy documents with my own seneschal Aldrich when I first saw her. She was not, to any visible measure, remarkable. She sat at the far end of the long document table, alone in the way that record keepers are always alone at such gatherings, present by necessity, ignored by custom. She wore the gray work dress of a border pack scribe, ink-stained at the cuffs, her dark hair pinned back with a practical efficiency that suggested she cared about the work and not the appearance of the work. A stack of bound volumes occupied one side of the table, a fresh copybook and an inkwell occupied the other, and in front of her lay a document that I recognized, even at distance, as one of the oldest texts in Ashenvere's archive, a secondary record of the founding oath, the kind of document that most record keepers requested once, glanced at, and set aside. She had not set it aside. She was reading it with the intensity a physician might bring to a patient whose illness had not yet been named. "Whose scribe is that?" I asked Aldrich quietly. He looked. "Thornfin's, my lord. Lord Cade's delegation." Lord Cade of Thornfin, the smallest of the 7 great packs, a border kingdom known more for its iron mines than for its political weight. His candidacy for High Warden was, in the polite estimation of every other lord here, a formality. He had presented himself because the rules required 7 declarations. He was not expected to win. And he had brought, as his record keeper, a young woman in an ink-stained dress who was reading the founding oath documents as though she expected to find something in them that everyone else had missed. I noticed her. I noted that I noticed her, and I moved on to the candidacy documents because there was work to do and 4 days were shorter than they seemed. I did not think about her again until that night. The founding records held a secondary archive in the east wing of Ashenvere, accessible to all delegations' record keepers, and after the evening meal I walked through the East Passage on my way to a private meeting with Lord Edric of Greymount, the leading candidate, the one whose name I expected to speak at the naming ceremony, and I passed the open door of the archive. The candles inside were still lit. It was past the 9th hour, and every other scribe had retired. She was still there. I stopped in the doorway. She had not heard me. She was entirely absorbed, and the archive was full of the soft, purposeful quiet of someone who has forgotten that the hour is late. She had 3 texts open simultaneously, cross-referencing with the kind of focused attention I had only ever seen in my best senior advisors. I looked at the spines. The founding oath record, a secondary chronicle of the Ironwing's binding, a document so old that its parchment was brown at the edges and its ink had faded to the color of rust. And a third text, one I did not recognize, small and bound in worn leather, that she was reading with her finger trailing beneath the lines, her lips moving slightly as though translating as she went. "The archive closes at the 10th hour, I said. She startled, though she did not knock anything over. Her instinct, even surprised, was to protect the documents. Both hands came flat to the open pages to steady them. Then she looked up at me, and for a moment she simply took in who I was, my height, my rank marks, the crest at my collar, and I watched the faint color rise in her face and then, remarkably, settle. She was not the kind of person who dissolved in the presence of rank. She acknowledged it, assessed it, and composed herself in the space of perhaps 4 seconds. "I know," she said. "I'll be done before then." "What are you looking for?" She hesitated, the hesitation of someone deciding how much of a working thought to share with a stranger, regardless of their rank. "The Ironwing's name," she said at last. "Its true name. The documents describe it. They reference it. They say it was spoken at the binding 300 years ago, but none of the main texts actually record it. I thought it might be in the secondary chronicle." She glanced at the brown-edged volume. "It isn't. So I found a tertiary reference, a field account, written by one of the witnesses, and I'm working through the translation." I looked at the small, worn book in front of her. A field account from 3 centuries ago, written in the old High Northern script, which was not a language anyone taught routinely anymore. "You can read the old script," I said. "Slowly," she said. "I've been working at it for 2 years. I'm better at reading it than speaking it." I should have asked her why. I should have asked her what had prompted a borderpack scribe to spend 2 years learning a script that had no practical use in the day-to-day work of a record keeper. Instead, I stood in the doorway another moment, watching her settle back to her work with the calm efficiency of someone who had not yet finished. And I said, "The 10th hour, then," and moved on. I thought about her on the walk to Edric's quarters. I was not certain why. She had given me nothing to think about in any conventional sense. She was a scribe from the smallest delegation, doing archival research in the small hours of the evening. But the image of her hands flat on those ancient documents, the composure that had surfaced in her face once the surprise passed, the matter-of-fact way she had said the Ironwing's name, as though it was a puzzle she intended to solve, did not leave me cleanly. There was something in it, I did not know what. The candidacy presentations occupied the second and third days, and they were thorough and dull in the way of formal proceedings, which is to say that every lord spoke well and at length, and every argument was sound, and by the end of the third afternoon the outcome had not changed. Lord Edric of Greymont would be the next High Warden. He was the eldest of the candidates, the most experienced, the most broadly respected. His pack had held 3 wardenships in the last 2 centuries. The vote, which would be cast in sealed documents the following morning, was as close to a foregone conclusion as the Ironmoot could produce. I slept lightly that night. This was not unusual for me at Ashenvere. Something in the stone of the old fortress made sleep shallow, made the hours between midnight and dawn feel longer than they were. I had put it down to the weight of the Ironmoot, to 7 years of held-back tension finally nearing resolution. The sound that woke me was not large. It was not the crash or roar I might have imagined. It was a single low tone, like a great bell struck once and then immediately muffled, felt as much as heard, a resonance in the floor and the walls and the marrow of my bones. And then silence. And then, from somewhere below, a grinding of stone that had not moved in 300 years. I was dressed and in the corridor in under a minute. Aldrich met me at the stair, candle in hand, his face pale. "The sunken court," he said, and we ran. The 7 champion lords were already there or arriving. Their guard wolves lined the gallery above the court, and the sound of alarmed voices filled the air, and beneath all of it was something else, a heat, a pressure, a wrongness that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the seal. I reached the gallery rail and looked down. The pillar at the court center was cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but a fracture ran from the pillar's base to its midpoint, and from the fracture ran a pale light, not warm like the candles but cold and sharp and urgent, the light of something trying to get out. The seal, the iron disc at the pillar's base, was dark, not merely unlit, the way it looked on ordinary evenings. Dark in the way of a thing that has failed. The engraved script was gone. The iron looked like ordinary iron, cold and pitted and old, and the compact that had lived in it for 3 centuries was no longer there. The Ironwing was awake. It had not yet risen. It lay still coiled around the pillar's base, but the stillness was not sleep. Every scale was up, raised in the way that a hound's hackles rise, and the great head had lifted, and the eyes, which I had seen twice before in my life and which were the pale gold of autumn light, were open and seeing nothing I could name. They were not the eyes of an animal in pain or of a creature in malice. They were the eyes of something that had been bound by a promise and had just discovered in the deepest place of its being that the promise was gone. Lord Edric was the first to move. He was, after all, the leading candidate for High Warden, and he had the courage that position required. He descended the gallery stair, crossed the floor of the sunken court, and placed his palm against the cracked pillar's stone. He spoke the words of the founding oath, which he knew by heart, which every candidate was required to know, in a clear, measured voice. The Ironwing turned its great head and looked at him, and breathed. Not fire, not the consuming fire of old-story dragons. A breath of cold, of winter compressed into an instant, of something so far below the ordinary temperature of the world that the stone where it landed turned white with frost. Edric was thrown backward by the force of it, not burned but shaken, his palm red with cold, and 3 of his guard wolves caught him before he hit the gallery stairs. One by one, in the stunned silence that followed, the other lords tried. Each of them was thrown back. The method varied: the cold breath, a wing beat that cracked the flagstones, once a sound so low and sustained that it vibrated the silver chains until they rang like strings. None of them were badly hurt. The Ironwing was not trying to injure them. It was simply refusing them, the way a door refuses a key that does not fit, and there was nothing personal in it and nothing to be reasoned with. By the time the 6th Lord had been turned back, the great hall above was filling with every member of every delegation, roused from sleep, crowding the gallery rail. I had not tried. As High Alpha and Ironmoot Warden, I was not a candidate for the wardenship, and to attempt the seal touch would have been a violation of the Ironmoot's order. I stood at the gallery rail and I watched, and I did not let my face show what I felt, which was the cold certainty that 7 years of held-together alliance were coming undone on the flagstones below me. And then I heard a voice at my shoulder. "May I go down?" I turned. She was standing 2 feet from me. She had come up through the crowd without noise, in her gray scribe's dress, her dark hair down around her shoulders the way it falls when sleep is interrupted, and there is no time for pins. She was not looking at me with the deference or the fear that the moment might have demanded. She was looking at the Ironwing with the same focused attention she had brought to the old documents in the archive, the expression of someone who has been working toward a thing and has just found, unexpectedly, that the moment has arrived. I stared at her. Every instinct I had, trained, cautious, protective of every soul under this roof, said no. "That creature has thrown back 6 champion alphas," I said. "I know," her voice was quiet, entirely steady. "But I don't think it's angry. I think it's frightened. It's been bound to a promise for 300 years and the promise has just vanished and it doesn't know yet what that means. It's not looking for something to fight. It's listening." She paused. "I found the name." I went still. "In the field account," she said. "The witness who wrote it, a border-pack scribe, as it happens. She was close enough to the original binding to hear the old warden speak it. She wrote it down phonetically in a footnote that has been sitting in the Ashenvere archive for 300 years, because no one who could read the old script had any reason to look at a footnote in a tertiary reference chronicle." She held up the small, worn book in her left hand. The old leather, the brown-tipped pages. "I finished the translation 2 hours ago." I looked at her. I looked at the Ironwing below, the great coiled body, the raised scales, the pale gold eyes that had not stilled, and I looked back at her. "If it does not work," I said, "if it turns on you." "Then I have misjudged the documents," she said, with a calm that was not bravado. It was the calm of someone who had lived inside this problem for 2 years and trusted their own work. "But I don't think I have." Every rational argument I had said to refuse her. Every trained instinct said to send her back to the delegation quarters and find another solution. I had been High Alpha for 12 years. I did not make decisions on feeling. I did not move on the word of a border-pack scribe I had spoken to twice. "What is your name?" I asked. "Ren," she said. I looked at her one more moment, and then I stepped back from the gallery rail and said, "I will be behind you on the stair." She did not thank me. She simply moved and I followed. The sunken court went silent as we descended. Every lord, every guard wolf, every delegation staff member who had pressed to the gallery rail, all of them watched without speaking. The 6th Lord, still being steadied by his wolves near the stair, saw her and started to say something. I put a hand on his shoulder and shook my head, and he stopped. The stair was old stone, wide enough for 2, and as we descended I was close enough behind her to mark the set of her shoulders, not braced, not stiff, but gathered, the way a person gathers themselves before a thing they have been building toward and are now prepared to meet. She held the worn book in both hands and did not look at it again. She had what she needed. The page was done its work. What remained was only the speaking. The flagstones at the bottom of the stair were cold underfoot. the air of the sunken court lower and denser than the gallery above, and the 47 candles made it luminous in a way that should have been warm, and was instead simply true, clear, and unwavering, like the light that comes through old glass that has been there long enough to stop being transparent and become something of its own. I took up my position at the foot of the stair, close enough to act if I needed to, far enough back to give her the space the moment required. She did not look back at me. She walked across the flagstones of the sunken court with a steady, unhurried step, the small, worn book held in both hands. She did not hurry toward the Ironwing, and she did not approach it the way the champion lords had, directly, with authority, with the assumed right of rank. She approached it the way she had approached the documents in the archive, with attention. The Ironwing had turned its great head to follow her from the first step she took into the court. I watched this happen, the slow, tidal movement of that vast neck, the great pale eyes shifting to track her, and I understood, for the first time with a certainty that was physical rather than intellectual, that it had felt her presence before she had spoken a word. That some part of the compact it was bound to had already recognized something in her that I had only just begun to name. This was not an animal on alert. This was a creature in the act of remembering. She stopped perhaps 10 feet from the great head. The Ironwing had not moved further, had not breathed its cold breath, had not raised a wing. The pale gold eyes tracked her the way an old and very still creature tracks something new in its space, not with aggression, but with a focus so absolute it was almost its own kind of pressure. She looked at the text, then she looked at the Ironwing. And she spoke. I had heard the old high northern script spoken aloud only twice in my life, both times by scholars demonstrating their art. The language had a weight to it, a physical quality that ordinary words lacked, as though each sound cost something to make and gave something in return. What she spoke was brief, perhaps 12 syllables, and her pronunciation was careful and exact, and carried the slight working hesitation of someone who had arrived at their mastery through discipline rather than fluency. It was not a fluent recitation. It was a careful, true one, and that, I thought later, might have been the thing that mattered. The name landed in the air of the sunken court, and the candles, those 47 candles that had burned unchanged for 3 centuries, flickered. All of them at once, a single collective tremor. And the Ironwing went still. Not the stillness of threat withheld, not the coiled readiness it had held since the seal broke. A different stillness entirely. The scales, one by one, settled flat against the body, the way a ruffled bird smooths itself when it finds again the thing it recognizes. The great head came down slowly, from its raised defensive height, and lowered, and at last came to rest on the flagstones of the sunken court directly before her, the pale gold eyes looking up at her from below. It was the posture of a creature that has been spoken to, correctly, for the first time in 300 years, and has simply been waiting. The gallery above was utterly without sound. Wren closed the book. She stood in front of the great bowed head and she looked at it, and I was close enough to see this. I was perhaps 15 feet behind her. She reached out and laid one hand against the side of the Ironwing's jaw, where the scales were smallest and finest, the way they are at the hinge of a great animal's face. The Ironwing exhaled. Not the winter-cold breath it had turned on the champion lords. A long, slow, warm exhalation that moved the loose ends of her dark hair and the pages of the book in her hand, and smelled of old stone and deep winter, and something else beneath it. Something that made the air of the sunken court briefly feel like the air of an older world, a world in which compact and keeping and truth spoken aloud were the things that held kingdoms together. And then the Ironwing lowered its head all the way to the floor of the sunken court, and was still. I stood in the sunken court, and I could not move. It was not only what I had witnessed, though what I had witnessed was the kind of thing that rewrites a man's understanding of what is possible, the kind of thing that makes 12 years of governance and measured certainty feel like a room whose walls have just moved. It was the way she had done it, not with force or authority or the assumed weight of rank, but with attention. With the exact, careful attention she had brought to an old footnote in a tertiary archive, to a text that no one had thought to look at, to a language she had learned for the most practical of reasons, and carried quietly into a situation that had, by the grace of that carrying, been resolved. There was a quality in it that I did not have a ready word for in the vocabulary I used for governance, something that sat between courage and competence, and the kind of deep, unhurried faith in one's own work that some people are born to and most never find. It was not only what I had witnessed. It was something else. Something that had begun, I realized, not in this moment but earlier, in the doorway of the archive, watching her hands come flat to the old documents, watching the composure settle in her face, and had been building since then in a part of me that I did not usually consult in matters of governance. The bond. I had not felt it in 12 years of ruling. I had stopped believing some years ago that I would feel it at all. The fated mate's bond was not a myth. I had seen it in others, had seen what it did to a wolf lord when it struck, had watched intelligent men become temporarily incapable of reason in the first hours of it. I had told myself I was relieved to have been spared. I had told myself this so many times that I had nearly believed it. Standing in the sunken court at 3 in the morning with the Ironwing at rest and 47 unchanged candles burning around me, I understood that I had not been spared. I had simply not yet met her. She turned around. She saw my face, whatever my face held in that moment, which was the full, unguarded weight of 12 years of careful control undone in the space of a minute, and for a moment she simply looked at me, the small worn book still in her hand, the Ironwing breathing slowly behind her. I saw in her expression the moment she understood that something had changed, though she could not yet have named what. She was too practical for sentiment she hadn't earned, and too perceptive to miss the fact that the high alpha of the Ironmoot was looking at her, as though the world had just reorganized itself. "It worked," she said, a little unnecessarily, and I heard the relief beneath the composure. "Yes," I said, my voice came out steady, which surprised me. "It worked." The gallery erupted. Not in disorder, in the release of 40 held breaths, a wave of voices and movement, lords calling to their wolves, guards descending from the rail. I heard Aldrich's voice organizing people, as Aldrich always did in moments of crisis, and I heard Lord Edric above the others calling something that I could not quite make out, and all of it was a very great distance away. I walked toward her. She was still standing in the court center, and the crowd flowing down the gallery stairs parted around her the way water parts around something fixed, because there was something in her posture, that quality of settled, unpretentious stillness, that simply caused people to go around rather than through. I walked through the center of it until I was standing in front of her, and I was close enough that I felt what I should have felt from the gallery rail if there had been more space between us. The warm certainty of the bond, not the crashing wave I had heard described in other men's accounts, but something quieter and more absolute. The way a compass needle finds north, not with drama, but with the simple, undeniable logic of two things that belong together. "Wren," I said. "My lord," she said, still careful, still composed, watching me with those steady eyes. "Where did you learn to read the old script?" It was not what she expected me to say. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "My mother kept an old text. She couldn't read it either, but she kept it because it had been her mother's and her mother's before that. When I was given the record keeper's position at Thornfinn, I started to learn the script so I could read what was in it. It took 2 years. She glanced down at the small, worn book. It turned out to be a domestic chronicle. Planting records mostly, nothing of significance. "And yet you kept learning the script." "I had already spent 2 years on it," she said simply. It seemed wasteful to stop. There was a practical logic to this that was so entirely her that it settled something in me, not the bond, which needed no settling, but the part of me that was still a king and still needed to understand the person standing in front of him. She had learned an obsolete language for the most pragmatic of reasons, carried that learning into a tertiary archive on the off chance that it would be useful, found the thing that no one else had looked for and no one else could have read, and then carried it down 3 flights of stairs in the middle of the night with the steadiness of someone doing their job. She had not known when she started looking that she would need it tonight. She had not known, 2 years ago when she sat with her mother's old text, what any of it would come to. She had simply done the work for its own sake, and the work had been there when it was needed. I removed my cloak. It was the heavy wool, the one with the high alphas crest at the collar, the one I had put on in haste when the sound woke me, and it was far too large for her and entirely wrong for a sunken court in the middle of the night, and I did not care about any of that. I settled it over her shoulders, and I watched her go still with it, not uncomfortable, but surprised, the way someone goes still when they have been reached by something they were not expecting and are deciding how to receive it. The court had gone quiet again. Not the absolute silence of crisis, but the quality of quiet that descends when a room full of people simultaneously understands that something is happening that is not about them. "This was not in my contract with Lord Cade," she said, after a moment, looking up at me. Her voice was mild, but there was a thread of something in it, not fear, not confusion, something more careful, something that recognized the weight of the moment and was not certain yet what the weight meant. "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." I did not look away from her. "The Ironwing responded to your voice, not to the 7 lords of the Northern Alliance, not to any candidate for the High Wardenship. To you, the Pack's binding answered to its name spoken by you in the language in which it was first made." I paused. "That is not coincidence. The old texts are clear on this point. The dragon spirit's name can only be spoken correctly by the one the founding compact recognizes. It cannot be forced into the right shape in anyone else's mouth." She was very still. I watched her take in what I was saying, the careful, lateral intelligence of her doing what it always did, assembling the parts into a shape she could examine. "You're saying the compact recognized me," she said slowly. "I'm saying the Ironwing did," I said, "which is the same thing." She looked at me. Then she looked at the Ironwing, which lay behind me in its long, peaceful repose, the scales smooth and the eyes half closed, and the silver chains hanging slack as they had not hung in days. She looked back at me. "I'm a record keeper from a border pack," she said. "I was brought here to copy documents." "Yes," I said, "and you copied documents, and when the seal broke and 6 champion lords were turned back by the compact's guardian, you walked down those stairs with an old translation in a worn book and spoke the one word in 3 centuries that the Ironwing had been waiting to hear." I let that sit for a moment. "The compact does not make mistakes, Wren. The founding texts say this plainly. It does not recognize by accident." "What does it recognize?" she asked, not defensively, genuinely wanting to understand. "Worth," I said. "A true keeper. The texts use the word differently from how we use it now. It means more than a faithful record keeper, though it starts there. It means the one who holds things correctly, the one who looks after what has been entrusted to them, not for rank, not for reward, because it is the right thing to do." I paused. "You spent 2 years on a language no one uses anymore because you had already started, and stopping seemed wasteful. You sat in the archive past midnight looking for something that might not exist. You walked down those stairs in the middle of the night because you thought you could help." I looked at her steadily. "The compact does not find people like that by accident." The thread of something in her eyes had shifted. I could not name it precisely. It was not sentiment. It was not the flutter of a woman pleased by flattery. It was something deeper and more considered. She was weighing what I had said against what she knew of herself, checking it for accuracy the way she checked a document, and finding that the fit was close enough that she could not dismiss it entirely. "The vote is tomorrow morning," she said after a moment. "Lord Edric." "Lord Edric will be voted High Warden of the Northern Alliance," I said. "That has not changed." I paused, but the seal is broken. The Ironwing is awake. The compact requires, before the wardenship can be confirmed, that the guardian acknowledge the new warden's oath. Without the seal, that acknowledgement must come another way. I held her gaze. The Ironwing answered you. The compact recognized you. Before the 7 lords of the Northern Alliance can confirm a new High Warden, the compact's keeper must be named. The silence in the court was absolute. I was aware of all of them: Lord Edric, Lord Cade of her own delegation, Aldrich, the guard wolves, every scribe and seneschal and delegation staff member who had pressed to the gallery above. I was aware of them the way I was always aware of a room I stood in, which was to say that I had catalogued them and set them at a slight distance in the way of a man who has been managing rooms all his life. I was not managing this room. I was standing in it. "That is an extraordinary claim," she said quietly, carefully, not resisting it, examining it, "for a woman who was brought here to copy documents." "Yes," I said. "What does it mean?" "The compact's keeper, what does it require?" "Presently," I said, "it requires that you be acknowledged as such before the Ironmoot, that the lords witness it, that it be written into the Ironmoot's record." I paused. "Beyond that, we would need to discuss it. The texts are not fully clear on every aspect of the role. They were written for a time when the keeper and the High Warden were often of the same household." I let the implication stand without pressing it. She looked at me for a long, still moment. In the sunken court behind her, the Ironwing breathed. "I would need to see the texts myself," she said. "Of course," I said. "All of them, not just the secondary chronicle. Every text in Ashenvere's archive is at your disposal." She considered this. She looked at the Ironwing again, and then back at me, and in the look I saw the careful, practical intelligence that was, I thought, the most essentially her thing about her. The quality of someone who does not reach for a thing until they have examined it from every angle, and who, having examined it, reaches with both hands. "I need a week before I can give you a clear answer," she said. "The founding texts are not a light read." "No," I agreed, "they are not. And I am still technically here in Lord Cade's employ." "I will speak with Lord Cade," I said. And then, because she was the kind of person who would want this said plainly, "This is not a command, Wren. I am not the compact, and I cannot speak for what it has chosen. I can only tell you what I have seen tonight, and what I believe, and ask you, not require you, to consider it." Something in her settled. Not a relaxing of tension. She was not tense. Exactly. More a settling of the kind that happens when a person has been waiting to hear a particular word and has finally heard it. "A week," she said again. "A week," I said. It was Lord Edric who moved first in the silence that followed. He came down from the gallery, and he was a large man, broad-shouldered, a decade older than me, the kind of alpha whose composure was as natural as breathing, and he stopped beside us and looked at the Ironwing's quiet form and then at Wren for a moment. "I never learned the old script," he said conversationally. "We had a scholar at Greymont who could read it, but he died 6 years ago and I never found a replacement." He glanced at me. "The candidacy vote will still proceed tomorrow morning, I take it." "It will," I said. "Good." He looked at Wren again, with the frank appraisal of a lord who has been in enough critical situations to recognize the person who solved the problem when he sees them, regardless of their station. "Thornfinn is fortunate in its scribes," he said, and moved away. Lord Cade was next. He was a small, wiry man, entirely unpretentious, who had known that his candidacy was a formality, and had come to the Ironmoot with the realistic expectations of someone who runs a border pack in a practical fashion. He stood in front of Wren, with an expression that was equal parts awe and the mild regret of a man who has just realized that his best employee is about to become unavailable. "You found it then," he said, not surprised, more resigned, the tone of a man who had seen this coming before it arrived. "The footnote in the Tertiary Chronicle," she said. "I'm sorry, my lord. I should have sent word when I found it. I finished the translation past midnight and I didn't think." "No," he said, "you were right to come down." He paused. "The Ironmoot's record is going to want your full name and your credentials for the witnessing." He looked at me briefly, then back at her. "I'll tell Aldrich." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and moved away, and I had the impression, watching him go, that he was a better lord than his pack standing suggested, the kind of man who recognizes what he has and holds it correctly while he has it, and releases it without bitterness when the moment comes. The lords of the other 5 packs came forward in turn. Not all of them were gracious. One, Lord Brennar of the Stormwall pack, whose manner tended toward the territorial, looked at Wren in a way that acknowledged what she had done while clearly rearranging a great deal of prior assumption, and the rearrangement was visible in his face as a man working through sums that keep coming out different than expected. But he came forward. He acknowledged what had happened. He did not dismiss it. This, too, was part of the old compact's design, I thought. The witness requirement. 7 great lords of the Northern Alliance, all of them in this room, all of them unable to pretend they had not seen what they had seen. Aldrich came to my shoulder as the last of the lords withdrew to the gallery stair. He said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing when nothing was what was needed. "Get the archive keys for her," I said quietly. "Full access all levels." "Yes, my lord." "And find her better quarters. The document archive is in the East Wing. She should have rooms in the East Wing." "Yes, my lord." He went. I looked at Wren, who was looking at the Ironwing, and the Ironwing, I could not be certain of this, but I thought I was not imagining it, had opened one pale gold eye and was watching her in return, in the calm, patient way of a creature that has found the thing it was waiting for and is in no hurry. "You haven't actually agreed to anything," I said. "No," she said. "I haven't." She looked at me. The cloak was too large on her shoulders, and the hour was late, and there was ink on her cuffs, and she was, in the still and candle-lit sunken court of Ashenvere, the person I was most certain of in the world. "I have agreed to read the texts. That is all I have agreed to." "That is enough," I said. She gave me a long, assessing look, the look she gave documents that she was not yet fully certain of. And then the corner of her mouth moved again, that precursor to a smile, and she said, "The 10th hour," and I did not understand for a moment, and then I did. "The archive closes at the 10th hour. You'll want to be there when I am," she said, "to answer questions." "Yes," I said, "I will." She nodded once in the manner of someone settling terms, and then she turned back toward the gallery stair, my cloak around her shoulders, the small worn book still in her hand, and I stood in the sunken court and watched her go. The vote was cast the following morning, and Lord Edric of Greymount was named High Warden of the Northern Alliance by 5 voices to 2, Lord Cade of Thornfen, by a courtesy that I suspected was deliberate, cast his voice for Edric as well. The Ironmoot's record was inscribed and witnessed. And in the afternoon, before the naming ceremony, the 7 champion lords gathered in the sunken court while Aldrich entered into the formal record, for the first time in 300 years, the name and credentials of the compact's keeper. Wren of Thornfen, record keeper, reader of the old High Northern script, the one who had found the Ironwing's name in a footnote in a tertiary chronicle and spoken it correctly, and stilled a dragon that had thrown back 7 lords. When Aldrich read the words aloud, the Ironwing opened both eyes and did not close them again until the record was sealed. Lord Edric came to the naming ceremony with the expression of a man who has accepted a great responsibility and is at peace with the weight of it. He spoke the founding oath, the new rendering, which the compact's keeper had spent the morning correcting against the original texts, so that the version now in use matched the intent of the binding more precisely than it had in decades. He placed his palm against the pillar's stone, against the seal that had gone dark the night before. The seal lit. Slowly at first, a line of warmth along the iron, tracing the engraved script as though rediscovering it. And then more fully, the familiar pale gold of the acknowledged pact, the color that the old texts described as the color of a kept promise. The Ironwing rose. Not in fury, not in alarm. It rose the way a creature rises when it has been called by name and is answering, deliberately, steadily, with all the weight and quiet authority of 3 centuries of compact keeping. It unfolded to its full height in the sunken court, the wingspan spreading until the tips almost touched the walls, and then it turned the great pale head toward Lord Edric and opened its eyes fully and regarded him for a long moment. And bowed. The head came down, the neck curved. The great body settled, a dragon's formal acknowledgement, the bearing of a pact accepted and a warden recognized. Every person in the sunken court knelt. Every one of the 7 champion lords, their guard wolves, the scribes and seneschals and delegation staff, all of them went to a knee, because when the Ironwing bows, the pack follows, and this is not a thing that needs to be taught. It is older than teaching. I looked across the court to where Wren stood at the edge of the assembly, the archive keys on their iron ring held in one hand, watching with the expression of someone who has been waiting to see whether a thing will work and is now watching it work. Her face in the candlelight was composed and warm and absolutely her own, and she felt my gaze and looked at me across the bowing assembly, and this time the corner of her mouth moved all the way into a smile. I crossed the court to her. The ceremony was done. The lords were rising. The Ironwing was settling back to its place at the pillar, its pact renewed, the compact whole again. I crossed the court in the unhurried way of a man who has a destination and does not need to hurry, and I stopped in front of her, and she looked up at me with the archive keys in her hand and the small, worn book under her arm. "Well done," she said to me, as though I had done something. "You found the name," I said. "You let me go down the stairs," she said. "Some lords would not have." "Some lords," I said, "would not have known to." She considered this. The smile softened into something quieter, more considered, the expression of someone who is deciding whether to be moved by a thing and is concluding slowly that they are. "The texts," she said. "I found 3 passages this morning that I'd like to discuss with you, about the keeper's role. They're more specific than I expected, more specific, I think, than anyone has read them in decades, because no one who could read the old script had any reason to look at them." "Show me," I said. She had marked the pages with slips of paper. She was the kind of person who used slips of paper, clean-edged and practical, not the grand ribbon markers of ceremony documents. We sat together at the archive table in the late afternoon light, my cloak folded on the table beside us because the east wing was warm and she had returned it to me without ceremony after the morning meeting, and she laid the old texts open and showed me the passages she had found, translating as she went, and I asked questions, and she answered them, and the questions led to other questions, and the afternoon became evening before either of us looked up from the table. The keep role, it turned out, was not a passive one. The old texts were clear on this, and Wren had been right that they were more specific than anyone had read them in modern times. The keeper was not merely a name in a record. The keeper was the compact's steward, the one who held the Ironwing's name, the one whose presence was required at every future Ironmoot, the one to whom the dragon spirit's acknowledgement was owed as much as to any high warden. The keeper and the warden were, the text said plainly, 2 halves of a pact that had always been designed for 2. The texts were also clear, in the careful language of the founding era, that this was not a role one was assigned. It was a role one grew into, over time, in the keeping of it. "It would mean leaving Thornfen," she said, when we had worked through the last passage, her hands flat on the open text, her head slightly bent over it. "Lord Cade has been generous. He gave me the position when I was young, and he has trusted me with things that most lords would not trust a woman of my station." "Yes," I said. "And it would mean all of this. She gestured at the texts, at the archive, at the iron ring of keys. The implication was clear. Not just the archive, but the iron moot and the compact and everything that came with it. Yes, I said again, all of this. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the archive window, the evening was settling over Ashenveer, the sky the dark blue of a northern dusk, the granite of the promontory catching the last of the light. Somewhere in the fortress, the delegations were gathering for the final evening meal, the formalities of departure beginning, the Ironmoot's business concluded. "You asked me this morning if I would consider it," she said. "Before the ceremony. You said you were asking, not requiring." "Yes. I want you to know," she said, "that I noticed that." She looked up at me, and in her eyes was the thing I had seen in the archive doorway and on the gallery rail and in the sunken court, that careful, precise attending, the quality of someone who does not miss what matters. I have spent my life in positions where my work was valued and my opinions were not always asked for, where I was trusted with things and not trusted with others. I noticed that you asked. I held her gaze. "I will always ask," I said. "That is not a thing I say for occasion. It is how I intend to proceed." She looked at me for a long moment, with the expression she had given the texts, thorough, exacting, not unkind. "A week," she said at last. "You offered me a week." "I did. I will have an answer by then." She paused. "I think I already have it, but I would like to read the remaining passages before I give it." "Of course," I said. "And I would like to write to Lord Cade myself, before anyone else speaks to him on my behalf." "He would appreciate that," I said, because I had spent enough time observing Lord Cade in the past 4 days to believe it was true. She nodded. She straightened the texts into their careful order, closed the volumes in sequence from oldest to most recent, the way she always handled them, and set the archive keys on the table beside them. She looked at the small, worn book, the field account with its 300-year-old footnote, and then she looked at me. "My mother's old text," she said, "turned out to be planting records, but the scholar who kept it, the border-pack scribe who wrote the field account, she was my great-great-grandmother, 4 generations back." She touched the worn cover lightly. "I didn't know that when I started learning the script. I found out last night when I finished the translation." I was very still. "The footnote is in her handwriting," she said. "And in the margin beside it in the Domestic Chronicle, which I've been able to read for 2 years but only looked at recently," she wrote a note. "In the old script, so I almost missed it." She looked up at me. "It says, 'When the time comes, speak clearly and do not rush the sounds.' It is not a difficult name once you know it, but it must be right." The candles in the archive window held their light. Outside, Ashenveer's old stone settled in the evening. Somewhere below, in the sunken court, the Ironwing breathed. "She knew," I said. "She knew something," Wren said. "Whether she knew what or when or who, I can't say. She was a practical woman. She wrote planting records and a field account and left her great-great-granddaughter a note in a margin." The corner of her mouth moved. "Very thorough documentation." "It runs in the family," I said. She laughed. It was a quiet laugh, genuine and unguarded, the first entirely unguarded thing I had seen from her, and it sat in the archive room and changed the air of it. Not dramatically, not in any way I could have pointed to, but in the way a room changes when the thing it was waiting for has finally arrived. I looked at her across the archive table, with the old texts between us and the evening light through the narrow window and the iron ring of keys on the old oak, and I felt the bond the way I imagined the compass needle felt north. Not a revelation, not a tumult, but a settling. A rightness so fundamental that the absence of it before now seemed like the strangest thing. The way you cannot feel a missing tooth with the tongue until suddenly, one day, it is there. "When you have your answer," I said, "I will be here." "You have an entire alliance to run," she said, with the mild practicality of a woman who keeps accurate records and does not flatter. "Yes," I said, and a compact's keeper to consult, who understands the texts better than anyone has in 3 centuries. The two things are not in conflict. She looked at me. Something in her eyes had shifted from the careful attending to something warmer, not less precise, but warmer. "I'll finish the remaining passages tonight," she said. "The archive closes at the 10th hour, I said. She looked at me with that almost smile. "Then I suppose we had better be efficient." We were, and the hour of the 10th candle came and went, and the archive keys stayed on the table between us, and neither of us remarked on it, and outside the window Ashenvere's old promontory held the night in its 400-year-old granite grip as it had always done, steady and unshifting, a thing that had been built for keeping. I thought, as the last of the documents were set in order and the final passage was read and translated aloud between us, of the 47 candles in the sunken court below, burning unchanged for 3 centuries. I had heard it said since boyhood. I had never fully understood what it meant, what it cost, to keep a flame burning for that long. What kind of compact could hold against time and neglect and the erosion of ordinary years? Now I thought I understood it better. Some things hold because they were built correctly in the beginning, by people who understood what they were building. Some things hold because the keeping of them was passed down, not always knowingly, not always with full understanding of what was being kept, through the careful hands of one generation to the next. And some things hold because, in the end, the right person came to the right archive with the right book and sat down without hurry and did the work. Wren set the last document in its place and looked at me across the table. "I have my answer," she said. "Already," I said. "I told you I thought I already had it," she said. "The remaining passages only confirmed it." She looked at the texts, and then at the archive keys, and then at me, with the expression of someone who has finished examining a thing from every angle and reached a conclusion they can stand behind. "Yes," she said, "to all of it, the keeper's role and all of it." She paused, and the composure in her face held, but beneath it I saw what I had felt across the court when the Ironwing bowed, the warm, plain, unhurried recognition of something right. On the condition that I write my own letter to Lord Cade first. "He would want nothing less," I said. "And that the archive texts are catalogued properly. The current system is inconsistent, and 2 of the oldest volumes are mislabeled. I will have new shelving brought in by the end of the week," I said. "And that you tell me what the old texts say," she said, "even when you think the answer is complicated. Even when you think I might not like it. I am a record keeper. I do not work well with incomplete information." "I know," I said. "You will always have the complete information." She looked at me for one more long moment, with all that precise attending the full weight of it, unguarded for once, the way it had been when she laughed, and then she folded her hands on the old oak table and said, "Then I suppose this is settled." "Yes," I said, "I suppose it is." Below us in the sunken court, the Ironwing slept. The 47 candles burned unchanged. And the archive at Ashenvere held its light a little longer than it might have, and neither of us moved to leave, and what had been settled between us in the small hours of a northern night was not spoken again that evening, because it did not need to be. It was already written, in the oldest and most reliable record there is, the one that does not require a footnote or a clarification or a margin note from a great-great-grandmother who understood what she was keeping and passed it down correctly. 4 generations, until the right hands arrived to hold it.